to just read this particular part of the Gosho through.
It is now clear that those who are born in this land and believe in this sutra, when its propagation is undertaken in the latter day of the law, will suffer persecutions even more severe than those which occurred in the Buddha's lifetime. In that age, the master was a Buddha, and his disciples were great bodhisattvas and arhats. Moreover, the Buddha expounded the Lotus Sutra only after he had thoroughly taught and trained everyone who was to hear it, including the gods, humans both lay and ordained, and the 8 kinds of lowly beings. Still, some of his followers rejected it. Now, in the latter day of the law, even though the teaching, the people's capacity, and the time for propagation are in accord, we must expect all the more hostility. For this is the age of conflict, in which the pure law has been lost. Moreover, the teacher is but a common person, and his disciples come from among impious men, defiled by the 3 poisons. For this reason, people reject the virtuous teacher and seek out evil priests instead. What is more, once you become a follower of the Lotus Sutra's true votary, whose practice accords with the Buddha's teachings, you are bound to face the 3 powerful enemies. Therefore, from the very day you take faith in this teaching, you should be fully prepared to face the 3 kinds of persecutions, which are certain to be more terrible now after the Buddha's passing. Although my disciples had already heard this, some became so terrified when both great and small persecutions confronted us that they even forsook their faith. Did I not warn you in advance? I have been teaching you day and night directly from the sutra which says, "Since hatred and jealousy abound even during the lifetime of the Buddha, how much worse will it be in the world after his passing? You have no reason to be suddenly frightened when you witness me driven from my home, wounded or officially censured and exiled, this time to a distant province." Question. The votary who practices according to the Buddha's teachings should live a peaceful life in this world. Why then are you beset by the 3 powerful enemies? Answer. Shakyamuni faced the 9 great persecutions for the sake of the Lotus Sutra. In the distant past, Bodhisattva Fukyo was attacked with sticks and stones. Chu Taosheng was exiled to Mount Su. Priest Fa Tao was branded on the face, and Aryasena was beheaded. The great teacher Tiantai was opposed by the 7 northern and 3 southern sects, and the great teacher Dengyo was vilified by the 6th sect in the old capital of Nara. The Buddha and these bodhisattvas and great saints were all votaries of the Lotus Sutra, yet they suffered great persecutions. If you deny that they practiced according to the Buddha's teachings, where then can you find those who did? This is the age of conflict in which the pure law has been lost. Moreover, in this evil country, the ruler, his ministers, and even the general public are without exception tainted by slander. They have opposed the true teaching and revered heretical doctrines and priests instead. Therefore, demons have invaded the land furiously, causing the 3 calamities and 7 disasters to strike again and again. This is indeed an accursed time to live in this land. However, the Buddha has commanded me to be born in this age, and it would be impossible to go against his decree. And so I have put complete faith in the sutra and launched the battle of the provisional and true teaching. Donning the armor of endurance and girding myself with the sword of the true teaching, I have raised the banner of Myoho Renge Kyo, the essence of the entire 8 volumes of the Lotus Sutra. Then, drawing the bow of the Buddha's declaration, I have not yet revealed the truth, and notching the arrow of honestly discarding the provisional teachings, I have mounted the cart drawn by the great white ox and battered down the gates of the provisional teachings. Attacking first one and then another, I have refuted the Nembutsu, Shingon, Zen, Ritsu, and other sects. Some of my adversaries have fled headlong, while others have retreated, and still others have been captured to be become my disciples. I continue to repulse their attacks and defeat them, but there are legions of enemies opposing the single king of the law and the handful who follow him. So the battle goes on, even today.
Thank you very much. It's essential to really understand the purpose of Nichiren Daishonin writing this Gosho, that we should really understand and feel his life. And this is going to be what I shall talk about most in the first part of this lecture. I want us all together to review Nichiren Daishonin's life and to feel it deep in our own lives. So some of you here already know a lot about Nichiren Daishonin's life. Maybe others who are new to the practice know not so much at the moment. Either way, it's necessary to refresh ourselves regularly in reading the Gosho, and through that understanding the life of this amazing man, which also, and this is the point of it, can be our lives. Not, of course, in the same form of persecutions and difficulties and obstacles which he overcame. Those were very specific to him. But we will have our own persecutions and obstacles in our own small way. And of course, we have to overcome them if we are going to attain Buddhahood. This is the theme of this Gosho, really. That if we're going to attain Buddhahood, then inevitably we will encounter obstacles and difficulties of various sorts. And just as Nichiren Daishonin overcame the incredible great obstacles that he faced, so in our way, within our circumstances, we can just the same overcome everything that we find blocking our paths in the future on the way to attaining absolute happiness through changing the unhappy aspects of our karma. In his New Year message, High Priest Nikken Shonin said, every incident in Nichiren Daishonin's life is of immense importance. We all know about Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. We can all do Gongyo. We can all chant Daimoku. But do we really know and feel and understand and relate to Nichiren Daishonin's life? In other words, if we are to practice the Buddha's teachings exactly as the Buddha taught, we have to be prepared to face obstacles and difficulties in our lives and relative to our lives just the same as he faced in his own. There is no such thing, in other words, as attaining Buddhahood or attaining lasting happiness, true happiness, without having to fight for it and make great effort. And it's through the great effort that we make that we grow strong and that we reveal our true greater selves. This is the point of this Gosho that we're going to study today. The first thing I think to understand is that in Nichiren Daishonin's times, this was an absolutely revolutionary teaching. In a sense, it still is revolutionary. But in Nichiren Daishonin's times, when he first declared Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, he was breaking or battering his way through the traditions of 2,000 years of Buddhism. So that's a long time. So that the earlier phases of Buddhism, where people followed Shakyamuni's teachings, of course had ingrained it in the lives of people, handed down from great-grandfather or great-grandmother to grandfather to father to son, on and on over 2,000 years. So of course, like all things with human beings, there is always resistance to change, isn't there? In any aspect of life, not only where the Gonzen is concerned. So one can imagine the incredible obstruction to change which was created in people's hearts through the declaration of this revolutionary teaching. So I feel it's very important to understand that. And it's also important for us to understand. Even though there are many people in this country who have never practiced Christianity, nevertheless the Christian tradition is deeply ingrained in all of our lives. I happen to have practiced Christianity. You may not, but you've been brought up by parents or in schools or in circumstances where one way or another that Christian tradition is deeply embedded in us. And the same applies, of course, to everyone else that we tell about Buddhism. So, of course, there is resistance at times. It would be absurd to imagine that we could do Shakabuku and move Causton Rufu nearer to us without opposition. In Nichiren Daishonin's times, we were reminded at the last Gojukai ceremony, he was still inscribing all Gohonzans personally for each follower. That shows you there weren't so many followers. So each Gohonzan was a Joju Gohonzan. And furthermore, those Gohonzans were not given to people until they'd practiced 15 or 20 years. In other words, for 10, 15 or 20 years, they practiced what we call Naitoku. Because Nichiren Daishonin was only gradually developing the teachings of that time. And they were having to break through 2,000 years of tradition in order to understand it. So when they reached the point of understanding, which gave them unshakable faith, then Nichiren Daishonin would inscribe personally for such followers or disciples their own Gohonzan. It's quite difficult for us to imagine that now, but this was the situation. Likewise, of course, all the Gosho were not written. You may know that out of 470 or so Gosho, of which we have only got a small part yet in the 2 volumes of the major writings, of those more than 470 Gosho, 10 are classified as the most important Gosho that Nichiren Daishonin ever wrote. And of those 10 important Gosho, at the time this particular Gosho was written, it was in May 1273, only 4 of the most important Gosho had yet been written. So again it emphasizes the early stages still, even though it was 20 years since Nichiren Daishonin had first declared Nam-myoho Renge-kyo in 1253. So to understand all this, we need to think back, 711 years it is since this particular Gosho was written. We have to think back and try to visualize the times that Nichiren Daishonin lived in. So of those 10 major writings, 4 had actually been written. One is called On Chanting the Daimoku of the Lotus Sutra. This has not yet been translated into English. It will be in due course, maybe in the next volume of the Gosho. That was written in 1260. And then, in the same year, 1 month later, in June, Nichiren Daishonin wrote Risho Ankokuron, securing peace in the land through the establishment of the ultimate truth. This Gosho, as you may know, is in part 2, in volume 2 of the major writings. Then he was exiled to Sado Island. That was the second time he'd been exiled. And on that wretched place, he wrote the 2 major theses of his life. One is called On the Opening of the Eyes, or in Japanese, Kaimokusho, and the other is called The True Object of Worship, Kanjin no Honzonsho. These are the 2 major theses of his lifetime because they actually explain the Gohonzan. Kaimokusho explains the Gohonzan from the point of view of the person, and Kanjin no Honsen Sho, that is to say, the true object of worship, explains the Gohonsen from the point of view of the law. Those two Goshos are in English. On Opening the Eyes is in volume 2 of the major writings, and the true object of worship is in volume 1. Now the amazing thing is that the first of those Goshos, those two theses, the Opening of the Eyes, was written in February 1272, and at that time Nichiren Daishonin was on Sado Island, living in appalling conditions in a little hut. I'd just like to read you briefly from his own diary, you might call it, which is called On the Buddha's Behavior in volume 1, about this place that he lived in. I left Echi, that's on the mainland, on the 10th day of the 10th month, 1271, and arrived on Sado Island on the 28th day. On the first day of the 11th month, I was taken to a small hut that stood in a field called Tsukahara, behind Honma Rokurazaimon's residence in Sado. Only 2 meters square, it stood on some land where corpses were abandoned, a place like Rendaino in Kyoto. Not a single statue of the Buddha was enshrined there, and the roof and walls were full of holes. The snow fell and piled up, never melting away. I spent my days there sitting in a straw cape or lying on a fur skin. At night it hailed and snowed, and there were occasional flashes of lightning. Even in the daytime, the sun hardly shone. It was a wretched place to live. In the yard around the hut, the snow piled deeper and deeper. No one came to see me. My only visitor was the piercing wind. The Makashikan and the Lotus Sutra lay open before my eyes, and Nam-myoho Renge-kyo flowed from my lips. My evenings passed in discourse to the moon and stars on the fallacies of the other sex and the profundity of the Lotus Sutra. 1 year gave way to the next. Under those incredible conditions, also knowing that the local people who were followers of Nembutsu wished to kill him, he lived his life, and he wrote the great Gosho, The Opening of the Eyes. This Gosho still exists in its original form at Taisekiji. In those days, they were written on long, long rolls of rice paper. But in the case of these early Gosho written on Sado Island, many of them are pieces of paper joined together, glued and stuck together, because he couldn't get paper or proper writing materials. So it's quite moving to see these Gosho, which are sometimes on display at Taisekiji. So this is, extraordinary for us, difficult to understand. But he challenged it all the way and never gave in, and he knew that he would live. He knew without a shadow of doubt that he would win through all these obstacles and that he would go back to the mainland and complete his mission in life, which was to inscribe the Daigo Honsen. Of that he was utterly sure. He had total conviction, in other words, in the power of the practice that he was teaching. At the same time, as he was undergoing these personal difficulties, the situation in Japan was terrible. It was the worst period of natural disasters that Japan has ever seen, and Japan has always suffered from natural disasters a good deal. But it was the most concentrated period, which continued for around 46 years. That's to say, constantly, one after the other, there were such things as earthquakes, incredible typhoons that came out of season, famine, floods, epidemics of disease, and so on. One thing following the other, until the situation in Japan had reached the point where it was such as is described in the Gosho Risho Ankokuron. And I'll just ask Fiona to read a short paragraph.
In recent years, there are unusual disturbances in the heavens, strange occurrences on earth, famine and pestilence, all affecting every corner of the empire and spreading throughout the land. Oxen and horses lie dead in the streets. The bones of the stricken crowd the highways. Over half the population has already been carried off by death, and in every family someone grieves. That's volume 2, page 3.
So despite that situation, or rather one could say that situation in itself drove Nichiren Daishonin on in his determination to establish the fact in the eyes of the people, and particularly of the ruling authorities, that they were not following the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, that they were still adhering to provisional teachings. Yet Shakyamuni Buddha himself had said, in the age of Mappo, which had already started, the only sutra which could give happiness to the people and security in their land was the Lotus Sutra. At the same time, samurai families were vying for power in ruling the country. At that time, the samurais had comparatively recently, in the previous 100 years, taken power from the emperor, who was no longer truly an emperor or a ruler, but a puppet. And the samurai families were ruling the land. And they were still jockeying for power. Very similar, actually, to the situation in this country in the early Middle Ages. So there was also always the threat of civil war, and every so often fighting would break out between contesting families. So for the people, this was terrible. The ordinary common people caught between the armies of these vying families, vying with each other, of course destroying their land, grabbing their crops and vegetables, using them for their soldiers, and leaving them destitute. Yet another threat arose. This was a foreign invasion. At that time, Kublai Khan, the Mongol leader, had swept across most of Asia and was already on the coast of the sea which lay between China and Japan. So the people were in constant fear of invasion by these incredible, fierce warriors who were famed for their cruelty and brutality. The Mongols, in themselves, had already determined that they would take Japan for themselves. There were constant rumors, people petrified. What an amazing situation in this land. We sometimes look around our country now and think that things are not so good, but they were even worse in Japan in those days. So, of course, Nichiren Daishonin's determination to remonstrate with the ruling authorities and try to put people right so far as the religion of Japan was concerned met with colossal opposition. The priests of sects were furious and indeed frightened by Nichiren Daishonin because of his power of debate. Wherever Nichiren Daishonin had been challenged to debate, always he found that he could convince and win that debate without too much difficulty. And these priests of other sects stirred up the ruling authorities against him, as you know. Despite that, despite being attacked, despite being ambushed, he remonstrated with the government on 3 main occasions. The first remonstration was in the form of the Risho Ankokuron, which he presented to the retired regent, a man called Hojo, who behind the scenes was the man in whose hands the power to rule Japan lay. Needless to say, it was turned down. And after presenting that particular thesis, his house was attacked just on the outskirts of Kamakura, and shortly afterwards he was exiled to the peninsula called Izu for 2 years, from 1261 to 1263. Now, in that Gosho, the Risho Ankokuron, Nichiren Daishonin said absolutely clearly and with total conviction that unless Japan changed its ways, so far as religion was concerned, definitely the country would be invaded by the Mongols. And sure enough, in September 1271, have I got that date right? think so. A Mongol delegation landed in Japan, demanding that the people of Japan would become subject to the chief of the Mongols. They were rejected, but of course this brought to life, if you like, the fact that Nichiren Daishonin's prediction looked as if it was going to come true. So then he did a second remonstration in that same month of 1271, saying that unless Japan changed its way, the people were bound to suffer in war from a foreign power. This particular remonstration he sent to Heino Simon. Heino Simon was very famous in Nichiren Daishonin's life because he was the sort of chief of the secret police of Japan, put in modern terms, the sort of head of the KGB. And he was the person particularly who persecuted Nichiren Daishonin. And in fact, after this second remonstration, arrested Nichiren Daishonin and took him to the beach at Tatsunokuchi to behead him. And you know the story that by amazing means this beheading didn't take place. We'll come back to that a little later. After that, after Tatsunokuchi, when they failed to behead him, he was exiled to Sado Island and was there from 1271 to 1273. Still the situation was bad when Nichiren Daishonin came back to the mainland after his exile. And incidentally, no one ever came back from Sado. This is another point we have to understand. But Nichiren Daishonin came back, and he again made his third remonstration, once more to Heino Simon. Again it was ignored, but on the other hand, his prediction came true, because in October 1274, that's the same year he made that third remonstration, the Mongols actually attacked the southern island of Kyushu. A storm or typhoon arose and wrecked the Mongol fleet, and the attack failed, though it involved huge numbers of soldiers. Nichiren Daishonin said at that time words to the effect that if I prevent the attack by the Mongols, then no one will believe in the Lotus Sutra, because he'd already predicted this was bound to happen. On the other hand, he said, if I do nothing, the people will suffer terribly. In fact, the attack occurred, the typhoon defeated it and destroyed the Mongol fleet. How was Nichiren Daishonin so certain about this? This was because in the Lotus Sutra, the principle of the 3 calamities and 7 disasters had been expounded by Shakyamuni Buddha. That is to say, if a country failed to follow the true teachings of the Lotus Sutra in the age of Mappo, then these 3 calamities and 7 disasters would occur. So amongst these 3 calamities and 7 disasters was foreign invasion. And at that time, this was the only calamity and disaster which had not yet occurred in Japan. Therefore, with absolute conviction, Nichiren Daishonin predicted that it was bound to happen unless Japan changed its ways. So through this, of course, Nichiren Daishonin became famous, especially in Kyushu. In Kyushu, to this day, there's a great statue of Nichiren Daishonin as being the person who defeated that Mongol attack. But despite that, and local popularity, still he was hated by the sects that he was opposing, rather naturally. And they still continued to stir up the ruling authorities against him. The Mongols attacked Japan again in Kyushu in 1281. And again, amazingly enough, a typhoon defeated them. Again, the fleet was destroyed. Many soldiers were drowned, hundreds and thousands of them. And the Mongols gave up from then onwards, trying to take Japan as their possession. So through this incredibly stormy life, Nichiren Daishonin was fulfilling all the predictions that Shakyamuni Buddha had said 2,000 years before would afflict the votary of the Lotus Sutra in the age of Mappo. In this sense, he was proving the direct and orthodox flow of the Buddhism of Shakyamuni through down 2,000 years to the teachings which he was propounding. So those predictions concerned attacks by swords and staves, attempts to kill the votary of the Lotus Sutra by the sword, and that he would be exiled more than once. So the attack by swords and staves occurred on a number of occasions, but in particular perhaps at a place called Komatsubara, where Nichiren Daishonin and his party were ambushed by the samurai, and Nichiren Daishonin actually suffered a wounding at that time. Attacks by swords and staves also took place, especially prominent in this respect was at the time he was arrested to go to Tatsunokuchi Beach to be beheaded. And I'll ask Fiona just to read a short extract from the Gosho called The Persecution by Swords and Staves in Volume 2.
As I mentioned before, I was attacked by the sword at Komatsubara in Tojo, and later at Tatsunokuchi. No one else has been thus assaulted for the sake of the Lotus Sutra even once, but I, Nichiren, have been so assaulted twice. As for being attacked with staves, I have already been struck in the face by Shofubo with the scroll of the 5th volume of the Lotus Sutra. Strangely enough, it is precisely that volume which carries the prediction that the votaries of the Lotus Sutra will be attacked with staves.
You should understand that the Gosho in those days, as I said earlier, were written, and also the Lotus Sutra and all Buddhist sutras were written on long sheets of rice paper. And these were wound round a pole on which they were carried. So it was with that pole carrying the Lotus Sutra, 5th volume, that Nichiren Daishonin was struck. Then, of course, at Tatsunokuchi, the attempt was made to kill him, behead him by the sword. And it's best, I think, again, to listen to Nichiren Daishonin's own description of this particular event.
Finally, we came to a place that I knew must be the site of my execution. Indeed, the soldiers stopped and began to mill around in excitement. Shijo Kingo, in tears, said, "These are your last moments." I replied, "How thoughtless you are. You should be delighted at this great fortune. Don't you remember your promise?" I had no sooner said this when a brilliant orb, as bright as the moon, burst forth from the direction of Enoshima, shooting across the sky from southeast to northwest. It was shortly before dawn, and still too dark to see anyone's face, but the radiant object clearly illuminated everyone like bright moonlight. The executioner fell on his face, his eyes blinded. The soldiers were terrified and panic-stricken. Some ran off into the distance. Some jumped from their horses and knelt on the ground, and others crouched down in their saddles. I called out, "Here, why do you shrink from this miserable prisoner? Come nearer, come closer." But no one would approach. "What if the dawn should break? You must hasten to execute me, for you will find it unbearable to do so after sunrise." I urged them on, but they made no response. They waited a short time, and then someone requested that I proceed to Echi in the same province of Sagami. I replied that since none of us knew the way, someone would have to guide us there. No one was willing to lead the way, but after we had waited for a while, one soldier finally said, "That is the road you must take." So the reference from On the Buddhist Behavior, Volume 1, page 182.
You can really hear, can't you, from his words, his absolute conviction that nothing would defeat him. Shortly after that, he was exiled to this awful island called Sado, which is incredibly bleak even to this day in the winter. But despite that prospect, still he was convinced that nothing could defeat him. Fiona will read again from the Gosho persecution at Tatsunokuchi. persecution.
Secretly, I learned that I am to be exiled to Sado by order of Regent Hojo. Of the three heavenly gods, the god of the moon saved my life at Tatsunokuchi by appearing as a shining object, and the god of the stars descended 4 or 5 days ago to greet me. Now only the god of the sun remains, and he is certain to protect me. How reassuring. The Hoshi chapter states, the Buddha will send gods in various guises to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra. This passage leaves no room for doubt. The Anrakugyo chapter reads, neither swords nor staves will harm him. The Fumon chapter states, the sword will instantly be broken into pieces. There is nothing false in these quotations. Strong and steadfast faith is the vital thing.
Do we have such faith when we know and hear that the Gonzen will always protect us? This is what we have to think about, isn't it? This absolute conviction that through practicing those teachings, Nichiren Daishonin knew that he was one with all the forces of the universe, which of course he calls God in the old language of those days. Therefore, nothing could destroy him. We are told constantly, aren't we? Don't worry, the Gonzen will always protect you, provided, of course, you keep in rhythm with the law of life called Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. So you can see how we can gain from understanding Nichiren Daishonin's life and remind ourselves our circumstances are never as bad as his. So we need to remind ourselves that Nichiren Daishonin was never destroyed, and we can be inspired by his conviction. Listen to what he said on the way to the beach at Tatsunokuchi.
That night of the 12th, I was placed under the custody of Hojo Nobutoki, lord of the province of Musashi, and around midnight was taken away to be executed. Entering Wakamiya Avenue, I looked at the crowd of warriors surrounding me and said, I will not cause any trouble, don't worry. I merely wish to say my last words to Bodhisattva Hachiman. I got down from the horse and called out, Bodhisattva Hachiman, are you truly a god? When Wake no Kiyomara was about to be beheaded, you appeared as a moon 10 feet wide. When the great teacher Dengyo lectured on the Lotus Sutra, you bestowed upon him a purple surplice. I, Nichiren, am the greatest votary of the Lotus Sutra in Japan, and entirely without guilt. I have expounded the law to save all people from falling into the hell of incessant suffering for opposing the Lotus Sutra. Moreover, if the forces of the great Mongol Empire attack this country, can even the Buddhist gods, Tensho Daijin and Hachiman, remain safe and unharmed? When Shakyamuni Buddha expounded the Lotus Sutra, Taho Buddha and many other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas appeared, shining like so many suns, moons, stars, and mirrors. In the presence of the countless Buddhas and gods of India, China, and Japan, the Lord Buddha urged each Buddhist god to pledge to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra at all times. Each and every one of you Buddhist gods made this pledge. I should not have to remind you. Why are you not here to fulfill your oath now that the time has come? Finally, I called out, if I am executed tonight and go to the Pure Land of Eagle Peak, I shall report at once to Shakyamuni Buddha that Tensho Daijin and Hachiman have broken their oath to him. If you feel this will go hard on you, you had better do something about it right away. Having spoken, I remounted my horse.
That is incredible. Why did he do this in public? Of course, he wished to prove, he had the conviction that he could prove his oneness with the rhythm and law of the universe to those people who were ruling Japan at that time. But also, and in a sense more important still, he did it for us. In this age, we are the votaries of the Lotus Sutra. He did it for us, to show us that no matter how tight a corner we get into, no matter how desperate we may feel, or hemmed in or trapped by circumstances, no matter how huge the obstacle may appear, we definitely can overcome it. In the same way as Nichiren Daishonin overcame his execution at Tatsunokuchi. So it's not very likely any of us are going to be executed. But we can come against obstacles which seem very great to us. The fact is that always, if one never gives in, if one goes on with one's practice, determinedly, as I put it often, sweating in front of the gonzen, calling on all the Buddhist gods just the same as Nichiren Daishonin did. Only we're doing it as we chant Daimoku. Then definitely all the Buddhist gods will come. The forces of the universe will totally protect us. So this is why he wrote this, and this is why he made this demonstration out loud in front of everybody, so that we who followed him could learn and understand. So what is the meaning of all this to us? The meaning is that to attract obstacles, opposition, either from people or things, is inevitable if you chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. That this force is so powerful, so creative and so valuable that inevitably the negative and destructive force of life tries desperately to prevent our advancing and becoming happy. So naturally, he says in this Gosho, naturally, why should you be surprised? Why should we be surprised by Sanshashima? Why should we be surprised because things go wrong round us? It's absurd to be surprised. This is the theme of this Gosho. And you no need to be worried because you can overcome anything. There is nothing that will arise in one's life that we cannot overcome. This is the lesson that he's sending us all. So if we practice strongly, obstacles must arise. If we don't practice at all, the result is that the 3 calamities and 7 disasters will occur to this country. That is the truth of Buddhism. That's what Buddhism is saying. So what are the 3 calamities and 7 disasters? Inflation, the 3 calamities: inflation, war, and terrible pestilence. That's the 3 calamities. And the 7 disasters: epidemics, foreign invasion, civil war, disastrous disturbances in the climate, or in the heavens as it's put in the old language, and unseasonable storms and droughts. So of course included in the 3 calamities and the 7 disasters is nuclear war, the destruction of our environment due to people's greed and so on. Which is better? It's much better to invite obstacles by activating the positive force in life and creating value and becoming happy through that experience of overcoming sufferings than seeing oneself between the devilish force of life and the force of Buddhahood, or Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. We have to be clear on this point. No good being surprised about it. Our weapons in this battle are to practice exactly as the Buddha taught. And in addition to doing Gongyo and Daimoku and Shakabuku and study, which are the 3 practices, as you know only too well, we must also expect to be met with obstacles and opposition, and we have to know, just as the Buddha knew, that there is nothing we cannot overcome in that respect. That is practicing the Buddha's teachings, and that is how we can grow and become strong. In other words, that opposition and fight and effort we have to make, it is through that that we develop our lives. Just like a great